Our webinar is a public health and prevention take on the marijuana landscape in Minnesota, a special webinar for Minnesota prevention professionals. This is hosted by the Public Health Law Center in collaboration with the regional prevention coordinators, funded through the Minnesota Department of Human Services, Behavioral Health, Housing, and Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services Administration. We have scheduled 90 minutes for this webinar. This is the first in a series of webinars that we are co-hosting about the new Minnesota cannabis law. This is meant to be a broad overview of key components of the law to spur discussion and identify key areas that prevention professionals would like to learn more about. There will be a survey after the webinar to solicit feedback about topics for up to 3 additional webinars in the coming months. Right, and thank you. So we'll know that we are all coming from different areas of Minnesota. So we just want to acknowledge that every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will, and some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hopes of a better life. And some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. We are standing on the ancestral lands of the Dakota people. We want to acknowledge the Dakota, the Ojibwe, and the Ho-Chunk, and the other nations of people who also call this place home. We may be the tribal nations that entitled non-Native people to live and work on traditional Native lands. Consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. Please join us in uncovering such truths at any and all public events. All right. So just a couple housekeeping. Speaker view is best view to view the slides in the presenter. So this is a webinar format, so all guests are muted. Use the Q&A function to ask questions or comments. And please fill out the follow-up survey and evaluation at the end of the webinar. And then this training is also being recorded and will be available through the Public Health Law Center's website, as well as the Minnesota Prevention Resource website. And so part of what brought this all together is a system of prevention brought to you through the Minnesota Prevention Resource Center, which is home of substance use misuse prevention resources for Minnesota, from online webinars, newsletters, trainings, and a resource library. They can help strengthen prevention efforts. Then we have Substance Use Minnesota. This provides impactful data to help you make informed decisions, monitor trends, share data effectively with stakeholders, and establish priorities in your community. The regional prevention coordinators. So your RPCs is the local point person on prevention efforts. We provide personal support and consultation to build your network. Put your plan into action, and evaluate if the plan is working or needs adjustments. When in doubt, contact your RPC and they will help guide you. And then of course you prevention champions, those who are substance prevention professionals, researchers, law enforcement, social workers, educators, faith leaders, or community coalition members. All of us combined will equal successful prevention in Minnesota. All right, and so we have 2 moderators today. Myself, I'm Kayla Baker. I am a regional prevention coordinator for our 7 metro counties. And then Marissa Katz, she provides legal TA on commercial tobacco control issues to public health organizations. legal professionals and advocates in Minnesota and throughout the United States. Prior to joining the Public Health Law Center, Marissa was a partner at a Minneapolis law firm representing clients in complex and class action litigations on behalf of consumers and employees in federal and state courts nationwide. Earlier in her career, Marissa was a staff attorney at Southeast Louisiana Legal Services Incorporated, where she provided civil legal aid, advocacy, and community education to low-income individuals in New Orleans and Southeast Louisiana. And then we have Rachel Callanan, who is the lead staff attorney at the Public Health Law Center and is the lead attorney for the center's Minnesota Commercial Tobacco Technical Assistance Project, along with providing technical assistance on commercial tobacco control issues to public health professionals and organizations, legal professionals, and advocates throughout the United States. Rachel has also spent the last 5 years analyzing and understanding the intersections of cannabis policy and commercial tobacco policy in states that have legalized adult use cannabis. Over the last 2 years, she has been providing analysis of Minnesota community efforts to regulate Delta-8 THC products, analyzing the policy adopted in 2022 to legalize THC edibles in Minnesota, including providing resources for local policy development and tracking local regulations of those new products. Most recently, Rachel has provided analysis of Minnesota's adult use legalization law to understand the public health and prevention implications of the new law. And with that, I will pass it over to Marissa.
Thank you, Kayla. And just a few quick words about the Public Health Law Center. We are a team of attorneys, policy analysts, and support staff working to address public health through the power of law. Rachel and I work in our commercial tobacco program, and we also have programs that specifically focus on healthy eating and active living, as well as a program on climate justice. The Public Health Law Center offers free legal technical assistance to communities, public health advocates, and other partners. We also publish on important issues pertaining to commercial tobacco control, and we offer trainings and webinars. We do not provide direct legal representation, nor do we engage in lobbying. Nothing, and just as a disclaimer, nothing in this presentation should be considered legal advice, of course, and it's strongly suggested that you do consult your own legal attorney with any questions specifically. And finally, equity is at the core of our work. We strive to do research, policy analysis, and develop policies that appropriately address the needs of all our community members. Particularly important in this arena of cannabis legalization, where there's so much at stake for community members. And with that, I will send it over to Rachel.
Great. Thank you, Marissa and Kayla and Stephanie. We are thrilled to be here today talking with you all about cannabis. So I am going to give you sort of the overview of the law. It's a very complex law, as you might expect. And, you know, I think I want to really emphasize that. And I pulled up this slide because I wanted to emphasize that these issues with the cannabis law really intersect in all areas of our lives, from, you know, health, municipal regulation, schools, you know, not just, you know, from daycare all the way through post-secondary education. There are going to be implications of this new cannabis law, employment law issues, tribal sovereignty, food safety, product safety, and of course, social justice and racial equity, and the social determinants of health are, you know, really critical issues. So, you know, all of that to say, we have a lot of issues to cover today. And I just want to emphasize the complexity of these issues. With that, I do want to give us the 10,000 foot overview of this complex law. It's about 320 pages long. And obviously we can't cover all the ins and outs about the law. But I do, we want to give you some of the highlights or lowlights depending on your perspective. I think one of the issues I did want to just raise is, or actually a couple things. One, Public Health Law Center does not have a position on legalization of cannabis. We really are just here to provide educational analysis, and we are not in the business of trying to, lobby for any particular outcome. So with that being said, all of our analysis is conducted through a public health and prevention lens. And so it is a little unique or a little different perspective than some of the analysis that you might hear from others who are currently, providing information about and background about the law. The other thing that I wanted to just mention quickly too is that, and Marissa mentioned this already too, like the importance of equity in this discussion. And I want to emphasize that we're going to cover a lot of ground today, but one area we're not going to dive deeply into is the social equity provisions in the law, including decriminalization, expungement, and the preference for social equity applicants in the business regulations that they're going to put in place. So, but I want to just emphasize that those are really important issues and much deserving of further analysis from a public health and prevention perspective. We just don't have the time to cover all of those issues today. So before we dive into the nitty-gritty details, I want to just pose a question to all of you, and let's take about 5 minutes, I think, to throw in the chat your thoughts about the new law. What are the questions that you and your colleagues are getting? What about the law are you excited about? Maybe there are some good things that you're excited about. What are you worried about? What are sort of the issues that are really bubbling up for you in your conversations? And I will since I'm sharing my screen, I don't have the ability to see the comments. So I'll let Marissa just, repeat some of those thoughts that you all are sharing.
Yeah, questions are just starting to come into the chat. We have one, a question about funding, which I know you'll talk about a little bit later, concerning what will be set aside for education and prevention. And there's also, they are coming in fast. Cities are also asking, what specifically do we have to do and what can we regulate? So that's going to be, of course, you are addressing issues about local control and local authority as well. But if you want to hit a high point on either of those while I go through some of these others, we can talk a little bit about that. Lots of questions about local control. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, that is sort of the question of the day is what can local jurisdictions do now? And what can they do as the law takes effect and more of the regulations are put in place through the Office of Cannabis Management. So we are going to cover some of that and also point you to some resources from League of Minnesota Cities that provides much more in-depth background on that.
Yeah, there's also a great question about how will cannabis prevention tie into existing tobacco prevention? And I think that's definitely where the Public Health Law Center has a role to play in the lessons that we've learned over the last 20 years in that. But yes, there are certainly some aspects that are parallel.
Yes, for sure. There's a lot of parallels and a lot of differences.
There's a question as well about density parameters and what that would look like. I know you'll hit upon that a little bit later, but there are parameters in the law. And more questions about local control. I think we have a big theme here. And relatedly, the law not allowing cities and other municipalities to opt out of legalization. A question, what can schools do now to help prepare? And that's another one. And just also not knowing, as you had mentioned, there's this is a huge law, and cities are concerned with regulations just because they don't know what those regulations are. So so lots of concerns being listed in the chat today, more than actual questions. That's the theme I'm getting. And here's one about how will medical THC be impacted? And again, the intersection between edible THC law and the new cannabis law, and you'll of course get to that. Issues about child safety, labeling, messaging, how to talk to kids against the backdrop of legalization of a controlled substance. So yeah, I think it's probably there is definitely a theme with these questions, and including regulation of cannabis at restaurants and combining those. So, and in spaces where there's also alcohol being sold.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I think, nothing is surprising me there. I think, these are the common questions that a lot of us have been getting since the legalization. And I think we're going to hit on most of those issues. I think, one of the things that I keep reminding people is that, yes, the law passed, and there are a lot of specifics in the law, but there are a lot of things that are also left up in the air in the law, and are subject to interpretation or further work by the Office of Cannabis Management. So honestly, in a lot of these areas, we do not know, really definitive, specific answers, but we are doing our best to try to sort things out and get people, the best answers that we can get at this time. So with that, I'm going to jump into some of the details. And, of course, one of the first questions most people have is, what's going to be legal? What's legal now? What's going to be legal? And so what's currently legal, we have medical cannabis, which has been legal for some years now here in Minnesota. We have these non-intoxicating hemp products. So think about your CBD lotions and things that, are non-intoxicating. And then we have these hemp-derived THC edibles. And they have been on the market and for sale in Minnesota legally for a little over a year now, as of July 1, 2022. And before that, we did have some of these products being sold, and they were essentially unregulated. So last year's law did provide some regulation, but left a lot of things undone too. So I'm going to talk more about that. But what is going to be legal now that this law has passed, you're going to see a whole panoply of whole range of different products out there on the market when the legal market is opened up in 2025. So, you're going to see cannabis flower, concentrates, paraphernalia, edible products, a whole range of products will be on the market. So when is adult use cannabis legal for use and possession? Right around the corner, August 1, 2023. So it's coming up very soon. Sort of one of the questions that is uncertain is, yes, you can use and possess cannabis as of August 1, but where are you going to get it? Because it is not legal for sale yet any place. And home cultivation will be made legal at the same time, but it will take several months before you are able to harvest anything from your home cultivation operation. So there's sort of a shrug of the shoulders, kind of unclear where these legal products are going to be coming from for use and possession. And, having said that, legal sales will not happen for widely across Minnesota until 2025. It's anticipated that all the regulations, everything will be set up, established to regulate the industry in early 2025. But until then, there will not be widely available sales of these cannabis products, with the exception that the Red Lake Nation has announced that they do plan to open up for sales of products as of August 1 of 2023. And they can do that because they are a sovereign nation, and on their tribal lands, they have the ability to regulate these products on their own. So they will be they plan to open up for retail sales on August 1, based on, and they're sort of dovetailing it with their medical cannabis program that is already in existence. It is possible that other tribes may do similarly open up retail sales before sales is widely available across the state. So I just wanted to make a note that is kind of one of the exceptions where you may see legal sales is on tribal lands. So, and I also wanted to just remind people, I already noted this, but a big reminder, we already have legal THC, intoxicating THC products on the market right now in Minnesota as of July 1, 2022. So as of July 1, 2022, all these edible products and beverages became available and were legal for sale in Minnesota. At the time that the law was passed, there are very few sort of constraints and restrictions on what and where things can be sold. To be fair, there were some, like there's a minimum legal sales age of 21, so that was good. And it did limit the products that could be sold to only edibles and beverages, whereas previously we were seeing vape products with these hemp-derived THC Delta 8 and Delta 9 products in them. So those vaping products, and even we would see, you may have seen flour that was for, combustible flour for smoking, that was, basically taking a plant product and infusing these THC products into that so that they met the requirements of hemp-derived THC. So, these products were on the market and are on the market, I think with more and more guidelines and restrictions. So that is a positive development. Because we're sort of in this transition period, the legislature did enact what they're calling temporary regulations for these edible cannabinoid products. So they, still are going to be on the market. Previously, there was no licensing required unless a local jurisdiction decided to require licensing and greater regulations at the local level. But at the state level, there were no safeguards like that. So one of the very positive things is that there will be registration required for sales of these products, and that you can't sell these products after October 1, 2023 without registering. And so, we're looking at registration opening as soon as August 1 of this year. So, we'll have a better handle on where these products are being sold. The products can contain hemp-derived Delta 8 THC and Delta 9 THC. Both have to be hemp-derived specifically. So, existing law allows the sale of these products. It does not allow for the other, I call it the alphabet soup of these other isomers that are also hemp-derived THC, but less is known about those isomers. And so the legislature did restrict the sale of products containing those. And for more information on all of these issues, you can check out our webinar, and these slides will be available to you. So you'll be able to click on the links I provided. As of May 31, the exclusive liquor stores can now sell these products. So that's a new development. And then there are some new and updated, stronger packaging, labeling, and testing requirements for these products. And that is very good news because up until now, there has been, very little oversight and regulation of the products. Minnesota Department of Health is now taking over the regulation of these products. And formerly, the Board of Pharmacy had been given that regulatory authority. And, to be honest, they just did not have the resources or capacity to really be able to do that, do the oversight and regulation very well. So I think it is a positive move to have the Department of Health temporarily taking over the regulation of these products. Eventually, they will hand that regulation over to the Office of Cannabis Management once that office is established. So, and then these temporary regulations will expire as of March 1, 2025. And that's when sort of a whole new host of regulations around these products will go into effect. So it will, to be able to sell and manufacture these lower potency edible products, which will be the new terminology that's used. You will have to be licensed to be a manufacturer and for sales of the products. So more serious licensing requirements and other regulations and oversight will be put into place. So that's a very positive, I think, development. I think there are still a lot of concerns about this parallel market of so-called lower potency edibles, when in fact they do have enough THC in them to be intoxicating. And, despite the limitations of how many servings can be in a package and that sort of thing, they still are, intoxicating and unfortunately widely available in a wide range of retail locations. So you probably are seeing them at your corner store, at your local restaurants, farmers markets. I mean, they are really widely available, and that is really not likely to change, with the exception that any of these retailers now would need to get a license. So what are the, or where can these products be sold? So the new legal intoxicating cannabinoids that are going to be coming on the market, they have very similar restrictions on their sales as other states that have legalized adult use cannabis. So not a lot of surprises here. So the only licensed cannabis businesses will be able to sell. The stores are limited to selling cannabis-related products only. So you're not going to see liquor sold in these cannabis business retailers. You're not going to see, other products like food products, candy, pop, bread and cheese, and groceries. It really is going to be an exclusive cannabis retail situation, and that's very common throughout the states that have legalized. No employees or contractors under age 21 or customers under age 21 will be allowed to enter the premises. So that is an important restriction. Restricted access to the products. So the products will be behind the counter in locked cases. There is they allow some sort of sample, not for use, but to like smell or whatever, view the products. But the products will be restricted. They're not going to just be like widely available on the shelves. Stores must have a security plan. They can't sell liquor. They have limited hours of operation in state law, and no drive-through or vending would be allowed, obviously. And this is in contrast to what I already talked about, the lower potency edibles and beverages. Yes, they can only be sold by licensed hemp or cannabis businesses or retailers after March of 2025, but they currently are widely available where other products are sold. So that kind of exclusive cannabis only type business doesn't apply to these lower potency edibles. That means that, youth are seeing them. These products are normalized by being sold at the, gas station or corner store or co-op, whatever. They can also sell these products where people under age 21 are admitted, or maybe employees of that retailer. So even though there is some restricted access for the edible products, and they must be in a locked case or behind the counter, this does not apply to the lower potency beverages. So that, I think, is particularly concerning, why these beverages may be available on the store shelves or in a cooler, wherever. They can be sold at liquor stores now, as I noted, and there are no limits on the hours of operation for the sale of these products. So they could be sold anywhere at 24 hours a day. The next issue I want to talk about is the law allows for these temporary cannabis events to take place. And there are some restrictions. So, no one under age 21 can be admitted, for example. They're limited to 4-day events. So they are intended to be very, contained sort of events. But however, the use of cannabis could be allowed, and sales can also be allowed at these events. So, some concerns about when you have a temporary event like this, how carefully are they going to be able to monitor youth access, not to mention just exposure. Having an event in a place where youth maybe are able to see the advertisements or, view the, whole event, sort of excitement or whatever around the event. So I think there are a lot of concerns about events that are well-founded. And I think the one positive thing in the law is that it does require local approval for these events to take place. So, the city or town may be able to just say, you know what, we don't want to have this event. So that's I think a very positive local control issue. So what are the personal possession limits? For cannabis flower, an individual can possess up to 2 ounces in public. And I want to show this image of, each of these images has 1 ounce on a scale. And so I think, the concern is that's a lot of cannabis to be carrying around out in public. But that's what the law allows. The law also allows up to 2 pounds of cannabis flower in a private residence, which is a lot of cannabis. And, I think my understanding of the rationale for why Minnesota has such a high amount of personal possession in your private residence is because of our short growing season, and because we do have the law does allow for home cultivation, that the idea being that people may need to kind of stockpile so that they have their cannabis for the months during the year where they can't grow their cannabis outdoors. And then, limits on cannabis concentrate, and then edible and low potency edibles as well. So where can and can't people use these products? There are a lot of places that people cannot use. Is fairly restricted on where they can use. So the law specifies that people can use in their private residence, including their curtilage and yard. They can use on private property, not generally accessible to the public, but the owner of that property can restrict the use of the cannabis. So, I think that's an important clarification in the law. And then, of course, use is allowed on the licensed premises of licensed establishments or a licensed event. Where cannabis is not used cannot be used is much longer list. You cannot use in a motor vehicle. You can't use if you're smoking or vaping the product, and it would be in violation of the Minnesota Clean Indoor Air Act. You can't use it in public school, correctional facility, and you can't vaporize or smoke where the vape or smoke could be inhaled by a minor. And that's an interesting one because that feels like a very broad restriction to me, and I'm not sure how that's going to be enforced. Perhaps complaint-based enforcement is going to be the primary way that is enforced. So having said all of that, this question of public use has come up. And I think a lot of us presumed that the law was pretty clear that public use would not be allowed. However, in a recent article in MinPost, one of the chief authors, Senator Lindsay Port, was quoted as saying that from her perspective, unless a local government proactively restricts it, use is allowed on public sidewalks and even in public parks, so long as they are not using near children's play areas. So I think that was a number of us were taken aback by that statement. And I think, the article also quoted one of the lobbyists for the League of Minnesota Cities as saying that that's not the way that she necessarily understood the law. But in any case, I'm sure that many local governments are rightly acting very swiftly to adopt further restrictions on public use, just to make sure that people are not walking down the sidewalk, smoking cannabis or using cannabis in public parks, if that really was the intent and is allowed under the law. So that's, I think, as I mentioned, I think earlier, there are a lot of areas of the law that are going to be subject to interpretation. And I think this is one of the areas, one of the really touchy areas that, we're going to have to wait and see how this is ultimately interpreted. In the meantime, because local jurisdictions can prohibit this public use, I think we're going to see a lot of local jurisdictions moving to act very quickly on that. So other restrictions on possession and use really depend on the location, the type of business, and the type of products. So here's a list of some of the different nuances on where use and possession is allowed. So like I mentioned, cannabis events, if they're allowed, they may consume on the premises, but must be a restricted area. And of course, it cannot be in any area that would be in violation of the Minnesota Clean Indoor Air Act. So for example, if you had an indoor cannabis event, you could not allow smoking or vaping of the cannabis indoors, because that would be a violation of the Minnesota Clean Indoor Air Act. Cannabis businesses allow on-site consumption if employees are consuming their own medical cannabis. And then this next bullet point is kind of a head scratcher for me: testing samples for quality control. Those terms are not defined. I think, it'll be interesting to see how, honestly, I think people will try to really push the boundaries on that, let's just say. And then if cannabis businesses are allowing on-site consumption, they must have consumption endorsement, is what it's labeled, from the Office of Cannabis Management. And then in the context of multifamily housing, of course, the individual landlords, common interest communities can have their own prohibition on smoking or vaping of cannabis. And then as of March 1 of 2025, smoking or vaping non-medical cannabis, so adult use cannabis, is prohibited in multifamily housing. And this was a provision that was tucked into the law with virtually no public discussion. And there is a $250 fine for violating this. And I think, again, a lot of people are scrambling to try to understand what this means, and how to deal with it, because, I won't get into sort of the nuances of it, but a lot of discussion needs to happen about that provision, let's just say. And then, in some, landlords cannot prohibit possession or use of adult use products, but they can restrict smoking and vaping. So, they do have that ability. And then there's also this nuisance provision that was included in the law. And I think there are, we're still doing some analysis on that, but there are some pretty significant repercussions for nuisance, if use or the products are in some way creating a nuisance on a property. There's some pretty significant ability to challenge that use. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out as well. In the workplace, I'm not going to get deeply into the employment context, because there are so many issues and nuances about this, but suffice it to say that employers are not required to allow cannabis use or possession while the employee is working. So, again, this is another area that I think we need to really roll up our sleeves and understand more about what all this means. And then, of course, sober homes may prohibit program participants from possession and use. And then still more restrictions. You can't operate a motor vehicle under the influence. You can't give these products to anyone under age 21. Businesses cannot provide free samples. And then this is an interesting piece of the law that I think is going to raise some really fascinating discussions in the daycare context. So for family or group family daycares, they must disclose if cannabis use is allowed outside hours of operation, and they must post conspicuous notice if cannabis use is allowed on the premises, but they must keep those products secure. So, I think, like I said, I think it's going to lead to some really interesting conversations in daycares. So we've been getting a lot of questions about school-specific provisions and, does the law change anything for use or possession in schools? And, really, I would say the short general answer is no. Things aren't really that different because use and possession is generally prohibited in the school context for both public schools and charter schools. I think, however, I wanted to highlight in this slide, there is this paragraph C that seems to allow for medical cannabis use, possession, transportation on school grounds. And, I think this is maybe in conflict with the current medical cannabis program and what's allowed under the current medical cannabis program. So again, I think this is one of the areas that we really need to get clarification about is or was the intent to really change the limitations on medical cannabis use and possession in schools. So again, school-specific provision, it is no surprise a violation of law to operate a school bus or Head Start bus under the influence. And then local control around the school context. One really positive thing is that local jurisdictions can prohibit the operation of a cannabis business. So any kind of cannabis business within 1,000 feet of a school or 500 feet of a daycare, residential treatment facility, or an attraction within a public park that is regularly used by minors. So this gives local governments that authority, but they do have to act to prohibit the establishment of these cannabis businesses within these buffer zones of these youth-oriented areas. So I think this is a really important opportunity for local governments to restrict. And, and I want to highlight too that especially in like small towns, 1,000 feet of a school or 500 feet of a daycare could be a very large chunk, if not, an entire jurisdiction, limits of the city or town jurisdiction. So just something to think about as you're communicating with your local jurisdictions. So next, I want to talk quickly about home cultivation. It's allowed August 1. Cannabis plants can be grown at a private residence, but it must be only a private residence of a person age 21 or older. You can have up to 8 plants. No more than 4 of those can be mature at one time. And they can be grown outdoors in a curtilage or yard, but it must be in an enclosed or locked space, not open to public view. So, some restrictions around that. The ability to do the home grow of the products. So we did in our chat introduction here, we did have some questions about, well, what are the packaging requirements going to be? And I think, from a public health perspective, we really look closely at these packaging and labeling requirements because, they really, depending on how things are packaged, labeled, warnings, and that sort of thing, you can really reduce the attractiveness to youth of these products. So the packaging requirements are that they must be child resistant, tamper evident, and opaque, or at least upon leaving the store, they must be in packaging that is plain, child resistant, tamper evident, and opaque. Servings must be indicated with scoring or wrapping so that people will understand that this is an individual serving for edible products. And then some other important restrictions: they cannot resemble common commercial or trademarked products. So in one of my earlier slides, I think I showed images of like a very similar Sour Patch Kids candy package that was actually Delta 8 THC. So that kind of packaging is not allowed. The packaging also should not be designed to appeal to anyone under age 21. Who I don't know who's going to interpret that or how they're going to interpret that, but hopefully they interpret that pretty conservatively, or I should say in a very through a public health lens, which would be, very few colors, very few bells and whistles, just basic information about the product, and very plain packaging. And then, of course, edibles can't be packaged in anything that the FDA has not approved for food packaging. So in terms of labeling requirements, so for cannabis flower and hemp-derived consumer products, the packaging will require all the basic information that you would anticipate. The background information about where this product is sourced, what the weight, the batch number, the cannabinoid profile, sort of what is in this product and where did it come from. They will also develop a universal symbol indicating that it's a cannabis product. And then it will also have to indicate that it meets the testing standards and verification that it actually underwent testing. This next bullet point I want to highlight here in yellow, the maximum dose quantity or consumption that may be considered medically safe within a 24-hour period. That has to be disclosed on the label of the product. And, again, this is another one of those head scratchers for me because I don't know who is going to sit down and determine for all of these different products what the maximum dose quantity consumption is considered medically safe. So I think that I understand the intent behind that, but I'm not sure how that's going to work in real life. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. The only official warning that is required in the state law is keep this product out of reach of children. So a lot of other states have much more extensive warnings. And so it'll be interesting to see if the Office of Cannabis Management does come up with some additional warnings, which I think from a public health perspective, we definitely hope that they will do. And they do have the authority to do that. So that's some good news. And then, I'm going to just kind of skim through the last. The medical cannabis products have and will continue to require patients' information. And that is kind of one way that we just will be able to distinguish medical cannabis from other adult use cannabis. So moving on to who's in charge. The Office of Cannabis Management will be established over the next several months. The Commissioner of Agriculture is given the task of sort of getting this office up and running. So no small feat that they have there. But until the office is fully established, the Minnesota Department of Health will continue to operate the Office of Medical Cannabis. And then, as I mentioned, they will be taking over the regulation of these hemp-derived lower potency edible products, taking that responsibility over from the Board of Pharmacy. Local control opportunities. There are many opportunities for local governments to institute some regulations, but they are quite limited. So, for example, they cannot prohibit a cannabis business from establishing in their jurisdiction outright. So they can limit, they have some ability to regulate, but they can't just, adopt an ordinance that says we will not allow any cannabis businesses within our jurisdiction. So the Office of Cannabis Management has a lot on their plate. And so I'm going to talk about some of their roles and responsibilities. And I think, for positive or not, I'm not sure, depends on how it plays out. They are given a lot of authority to act in areas that the law did sort of left open. And so that can be a good thing, as hopefully they approach it from more of a public health perspective, but that's not necessarily going to be the case. So my first bullet point here, in like the first paragraphs about the establishment of this new office, I think the very first responsibility that is listed is that the office must promote public health, welfare, and safety. And so, those from a public health perspective, that's exactly what you want to hear. A few more paragraphs down, they also have the responsibility to meet market demand and promote a craft industry. So from a public health perspective, those things are absolutely in conflict. And so, I think it will be really important for this office, to really wrestle with its different responsibilities and really try to maintain some impartiality in how they are approaching these regulations. And, I can't underestimate the importance of whoever the director is going to be. That person is going to really set the tone for the agency. And so I think it's going to be, it would be really ideal if we had someone with a public health background. So this office is also responsible for all regulations and programming for cannabis. So again, no small feat. They will be establishing, licensing, and endorsement of a range of businesses. So they will be responsible for establishing and licensing for 16 different types of licenses. They also, like I mentioned, they have the authority to adopt additional warnings and label requirements. So we hope that they will do that and take a cue from other states and the types of warnings that they have included in their products. And still on their very full plate, they also have the responsibility to conduct a range of studies, including an annual market analysis. They're required to establish a statewide monitoring system. So this is often called a track and trace program, where they will be charged with identifying where products originated, and then how they travel through commerce to the retail sales environment. That's a very positive thing that I think really from a public health perspective is a great facet of this law, because it really does help protect consumers and ensure that the products that are out there on the market have been approved by the office, and that they are only being manufactured and sold by licensed cannabis businesses. The office also has the ability to approve a whole category, approve products. So, and they can approve or reject whole product categories. So one of the things that has been on my mind is, you all, I'm sure, remember a few years ago when we had these vaping related lung injuries where people were getting very, very ill, and even many deaths across the country related to this vaping related lung disorder. And so, in theory, the office could say, because we are concerned about the impacts of vaping on lung health, we are going to categorically deny approval of all vaping products. I don't know that that's realistic, but I think that my understanding of the law is that it's a possibility. And so just something to think about for the future. And the other important thing that the office has authority to do is to set THC potency limits. And so the law did not do this, but they do give that authority to the Office of Cannabis Management, which is a very positive development. And, hopefully the office will conduct the necessary assessments to find out what are relatively safe levels of THC for different types of products. And then just a couple of small things here at the end. They are also charged with setting agricultural and food safety practices and setting environmental standards. And, the fact that multiple federal agencies and state agencies do this for basically everything else, the fact that they have to establish these different standards for these cannabis products is, again, no small feat, and is a really big lift for this new state agency. But they're not alone. They have a cannabis advisory council comprised of 51 members that is available to help them kind of think through and weigh, all the ins and outs of legalization. This advisory council, like I said, is comprised of 51 different members. I think, when you have time to look through the long list of those who will be part of this advisory council, I think what you will identify is that generally this is going to be a very industry, cannabis business heavy oriented group. And so even though there's room for, like, local governments have space on this council, local public health association, licensed mental health professionals and treatment professionals. I think, with 51 members, just the sheer number of people who are going to be more oriented towards cannabis commercialization are likely to outweigh some of the public health issues and interests that may come up. So the Cannabis Advisory Council has several duties, but I want to emphasize that these are non-binding duties. They do not have actual regulatory authority. They can make recommendations. They can investigate. They can call for public testimony, but they don't have the authority to actually make the rules or the law. So I think I don't want to underestimate the importance of this group, because I think whatever recommendations or actions that they do will have repercussions and will carry a lot of weight. And especially, we'll get news coverage and that sort of thing. So I don't want to underestimate their power, but just to note that their power is limited. So next, under who's in charge, we get to the really important topic of local control and preemption. And so, like I mentioned, local units of government are going to have a fair amount of local control with some significant guardrails that are in the state law. So they are allowed to enact ordinances with reasonable restrictions on time, place, and manner for the operation of cannabis businesses. But like I mentioned, they can't outright prohibit cannabis businesses. As I mentioned, they can prohibit cannabis businesses within 1,000 feet of a school, 500 feet of a daycare, treatment, public park. And they can adopt an interim ordinance to protect the health, safety, and welfare, including outright prohibition of any cannabis businesses until January 1 of 2025. And at that point, any of those restrictions that exceed what they can do under the law would have to expire. One interesting thing that was put in the law is that the local jurisdictions do not have to allow retailers beyond 1 per 12,500 residents. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But then also I had already mentioned that local jurisdictions have the ability to approve or reject cannabis events or restrict or limit those events. The things that local jurisdictions are not allowed to do, they cannot prohibit possession, transport, or use within their jurisdiction. So, someone driving through the town with their cannabis, the local jurisdiction cannot prohibit that. They may not prohibit establishment or operation of cannabis businesses, like I already mentioned. And then the allowable time restrictions are set in state law, so they can't go beyond, they can go a little further than what is restricted in state law, but they can't widely restrict hours of operation. So, for example, a local jurisdiction could not say, we are only going to allow legal sales on Wednesdays from noon to 4 p.m. That would be going too far. So back to this point about the limitation on requiring at least one retailer per 12,500 residents. So the law actually, this is the quote from the law, if a county has one active registration, that's retail registration, for every 12,500 residents, a city or town within the county is not obligated to register a cannabis business. So, I did some quick research and found that in Minnesota, there are 17 counties that have a population under 12,500. So presumably, if those counties wanted to, they could say, we're going to have one retailer, and then the local jurisdictions could say, and then we don't have to have any further retailers. This is another area I think will be really interesting to watch what local jurisdictions do to use this provision to attempt to, limit the number of retailers in their communities. So kind of, again, file this away as let's watch and see what happens with this issue. Local registration of retailers, local units of government do have the ability to register their retailers for legal cannabis. They can charge a registration fee. They can't charge a separate application fee. The registration fee is already set in state law, so they can't base that fee on, the actual costs of implementing this program. So, I think the following bullet points, this raises a lot of questions for me about where the local jurisdiction is going to get the resources to be able to conduct the compliance checks that they will be charged with. So they will be charged with doing age verification, doing compliance checks on operations requirements, and limits on different types of products. So, really, it sounds like local jurisdictions are going to be somewhat on the front line of ensuring that all these retailers are in compliance with the law. That's going to be, again, a very heavy lift. And then they also can, if the retailer's out of compliance, they can suspend their registration. So I'm going to just skip over this. Taxation, Minnesota is on the very low end of taxation compared to other legalized states. And so I just want to note that, and you can read more of the details here. As far as appropriations, I think there's some good news, some sort of mixed news on the appropriations side. This is a summary of some of the appropriations that are in the law right now. And I want to emphasize that there is a significant lag time from when legal use, adult use, August 1, 2023, it, is going to allow use of these products. Probably advertising is going to start, people are going to be out there trying to drum up interest in their products. A lot of these prevention programs and support for local public health, tribal health, these resources are not going to even come online until July 1 of 2024. So this is very concerning because we're going to have, the way I'm thinking about it is really putting the cart before the horse. That shouldn't we have prevention, education happening well before widespread legalization and legal use and legal growth of these products is allowed in the state. And unfortunately, that is not the case. So, we'll be basically playing catch up. But in good news, there is some significant funding, probably not enough, but $5.5 million per year is going to be devoted to this program, specifically for treatment, recovery, and prevention. I think, honestly, it is a drop in the bucket, considering that, these programs are already underfunded, and we are going to introduce a whole new set of widespread available products in the coming months, years. So, I think just it's good news, but with some caution there, and it's celebrating too soon. And then again, some kind of mediocre news. The Office of Cannabis Management is required to develop an annual report to the legislature. The first one is due in January of 2024. And in that report, they are supposed to make recommendations to the legislature about funding for an education program and model programs for students. Again, a day late and a dollar short on some respects, because the schools are already going to be dealing with this issue and already are dealing with it, but are going to be dealing with it in a greater scale in the coming months. And so we won't see this funding for another year or two actually going to schools. So that, I think is it is very disappointing. So I'm going to just kind of skip through these so we can get to questions. And I think I'm going to, should I stop sharing my screen for this segment, or what do you think?
Yeah, let's go ahead and we can sort of have our faces back on, and I can thank you all. It's been a very active Q&A and live chat. So it's been, I think, close to 100. So, and we have about 15 minutes left. So I'm going to go over some that I sort of saw common themes or threads so that we can try to answer as many as possible. And of course, we can, you can follow up with us and we can answer questions as well. We obviously can't get to everything in the time we have left, but let's go ahead. One of the questions was, who will be responsible for providing the cities and counties with ordinance language? In other words, comparing it to the world of commercial tobacco control. And is there anything in place yet with either in the realm of technical assistance or other role for throughout the state to provide that type of information?
Yeah, I think actually specified in the law was the requirement that the Office of Cannabis Management must work with local units of government. to develop model language for ordinances for, local regulation. So that's a very good development. Unfortunately, the Office of Cannabis Management will not be established for some months. And so that really leaves local governments kind of wondering what they can be doing right now. I know the League of Minnesota Cities and other groups are looking at providing model language for local jurisdictions and assisting them. Unfortunately, I don't think that there is for those of you maybe who aren't aware, Minnesota Department of Health funds very extensive local technical assistance for commercial tobacco licensing at the local level. And Public Health Law Center happens to provide the legal technical assistance for that commercial tobacco work, and other groups provide other technical assistance. But to my knowledge, that there is not a plan to put a similar kind of parallel structure in place for local regulation of cannabis.
So here's another question: can cannabis be grown in a household or multi-unit dwelling where there are people under 21 living? And
yes,
yes.
I believe that the answer is yes, they can grow as long as there is, it's the, I think the language is the primary household of someone age 21 or older. So, if there are kids around or underage people, that does not seem to be a barrier to having home cultivation.
Another question we got was businesses are starting to ask for training on laws for legal sales and compliance checks, and they're expecting public health to offer, basically how to engage in responsible sales practices and doing that locally. Do you know the role that public health is expected to play with respect to training businesses? Is it either with local public health or the Office of Cannabis Management, basically?
Yeah, I think all of those questions should be directed to the Office of Cannabis Management once it's established. In the meantime, I would direct those questions to the Department of Agriculture, because they are sort of this temporary interim, step before the office is established. So, I would say, if you're getting questions from, cannabis business or, individuals who want to establish cannabis businesses, that, it is probably not, within the purview of local public health to be providing, legal advice, certainly business advice, employment advice, all of those areas that they'll need to think about for establishing their business. It's just, that's not, in my view, that's not local public health's role. And if they want to establish as a business, they may want to hire their own consultants or legal team to help them do it properly.
So another question, and Rachel, you did cover this in the presentation, but it did come up a few times. So about how this will impact the Clean Indoor Air Act if smoking is allowed in certain places. And again, the new law can't supersede the Minnesota Clean Indoor Air Act. And the exceptions, for example, for on-site events will allow for an area to smoke cannabis, but it can't be indoors, and it will be in a restricted area that's outdoors. I wanted to go ahead and reiterate that point because it's a really important aspect. And we have a really strong clean indoor air law in our state, and we want to keep it that way.
Yes, I think that is absolutely the case. And I think, it was repeated over and over again in testimony and in presentations by the chief authors at the legislature that the intent was not to circumvent the Minnesota Clean Indoor Air Act. And so, any place that smoking is not allowed or vaping is not allowed under the Clean Indoor Air Act still applies to cannabis. And I would also add that local jurisdictions still have a lot of authority under the ability to restrict secondhand smoke exposure. And they, I know for sure that some jurisdictions are looking at revisiting their law to make sure that it is strong enough to, like I had mentioned earlier, restrict some of the public consumption that might, there's some confusion about whether there's wide public consumption is allowed.
And then there's a question about back when you were talking about the $5.5 million that's going to go towards treatment, recovery, and prevention. Do we know how that will be distributed, and will that be in the form of like a competitive grant process?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I think it will be up to the Office of Cannabis Management to establish that program and decide what the application process will look like, and sort of their prioritization for where that funding will go. It's not a lot of money when you think about covering the entire state. $5.5 million annually is just really a drop in the bucket.
For sure. And someone pointed out that the composition of the advisory council is tilted quite heavily toward business interests. And is there any way for that part of the law to be revised, either next session or in some other form or fashion?
The law can always be revised. So I think it's a matter of communicating to lawmakers what the prioritization for, what the law could or should look like. I think there were folks at the Capitol last year who were really trying to work with legislators to ensure that public health perspective was really the prominent feature of this office and the driver of this office. And, for whatever reasons, that didn't happen, but that doesn't mean that it couldn't change. And I think, I have a couple more slides. I don't know if we're going to get to them, but in one of my slides, I really emphasize that, people have the opportunity to really shape what this office could look like by, one, weighing in with the governor. The governor is going to hire the director of this office. And so, I think, that person can represent public health, they can represent ag, they can represent, any sort of background. And so, I think it's fair to say people could reach out to the governor and prioritize what they would like to see in the skills and expertise of the director.
Yeah. And then circling back to the housing issues that arise from this bill, is smoking allowed in, can you elaborate a little bit more on if you have your own condo unit and how smoking cannabis will play in that setting, either medicinally or recreationally?
Yeah, so under the current law, there are no restrictions in Minnesota law for common interest communities. So the Minnesota Clean Indoor Air Act does not address smoking or vaping in common interest communities. It does prohibit smoking or vaping in common areas of rental apartments. So under current law, there is nothing there to protect people in common interest communities. Having said that, HOA, common interest communities, homeowners association could adopt a policy that says we prohibit all smoking and vaping on our property, in units, individual units, in common areas. And we actually have, Public Health Law Center has a model policy for condominiums on our website. We can maybe throw that in the chat for folks. So that still remains an opportunity for individual complexes to adopt their own policy prohibiting smoking and vaping. And then, as I noted, as of March 1, 2025, there will be a provision that goes into effect that prohibits all smoking and vaping of adult use cannabis. So it doesn't cover medical cannabis. And if you're violating that provision in the law, there would be a $250 civil fine. So that is kind of the status of current law for common interest communities.
And then there was just sort of a clarification question earlier in the presentation when we were talking about lower potency THC products, and that now it'll now be regulated under MDH. And then when the Office of Cannabis Management is established, it will then go to the Department of Agriculture. Is that correct? Okay.
That's correct. Yes.
And then another question is, are there penalties for youth, use, and possession? And if so, what are they?
There are penalties, and I am not going to be able to rattle them off the top of my head. So whoever put that question in the chat or Q&A, will circle back with you and get you some information about that. But yes, the overarching answer to that is yes, there are. Okay, so another theme that came up was employment implications. And I'm not exactly sure the exact context of that question, but I think it will, of course, be up to individual businesses to continue, if they want to require negative drug tests as a condition of employment, they can do so. There have been stories in other states where there's been legalization that businesses are actually tweaking their drug tests to eliminate testing for THC. So that will remain to be seen if that happens here in Minnesota as well. But of course, that's going to be up to the individual business. I think if you work for the federal government, presumably you will, of course, not be able to use, possess, and consume while on the job. But Rachel, do you have anything else to add in with respect to the employment context? Yeah, I mean, I think that is another one of those areas that, we have not had a chance to really take a deep dive into from a public health perspective. I think there are folks out there who have been looking into the issues, and I think League of Minnesota Cities actually, and their frequently asked questions on their website, they get into some of the employment context issues. But employment law is not sort of our priority area, so I don't have a lot to say on that front.
And perhaps we'll have more later on that. But yeah, I mean, if there is a specific employment question related to public health, you can ask us individually and we can research that for you. Another question is, actually, this is a great question for a couple of lawyers, which is, what is curtilage? You referenced, it's one of those things that we assume is a commonly used term, but perhaps not. And just want to clarify, Kurt, when in talking about cultivating or possessing in your own yard, home, or curtilage, curtilage refers to the yard area surrounding your home. It can be like a yard shed or a garage or something like that.
Yeah.
And I see you have some slides back up, so I will turn it back over to you, Rachel.
So I'm going to just wind up with our last minute that, if there's one thing you take away from our discussion today is please do not throw up your hands in disgust or fear or whatever. There are a lot of opportunities to shape the implementation of the law, including, as I mentioned, the appointments of this new director of the Office of Cannabis Management, this advisory council. It really is going to be important to get good people on that council. And so I included the link for applications for where you can apply to be on the council. There are opportunities to work with your local government on, within the confines of what they can do to really push them to do the strongest public health protection, prevention focused, smoke-free policies, employment policies, educating the public, and also complaining. When you see blatant violations of the law, submit a complaint to the appropriate office. Right now, would be the Department of Ag or MDH. And then, of course, here is a set of resources that when you access our slides, you'll be able to click on these links and get some of these great resources that others have started to compile on this issue. And with that, I think our time is up.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel and Marissa and Stephanie, for having this webinar. So much great information. Just be on the lookout. You'll get an email for a survey and evaluation, and that will help shape the following webinars with Public Health Law Center. And then also look at the Minnesota Prevention Resource Center. There are also going to be some upcoming webinars and trainings with cannabis and talking about potency. So just thank you all again. Really appreciate it.